event that would contribute to the inability to cope or to respond to what's occurring. Would include threats to life or bodily harm, or beyond threats, actual bodily harm, or close encounters. So for example, if you were in the 9/11 disaster, but you weren't actually physically harmed, but all of that destruction and death and mayhem were around you, that would still, of course, be a traumatic event, and not knowing what to do. It results in your feelings of extreme helplessness. I can't respond, I can't defend, whatever is likely to happen to me is going to happen to me no matter what I do, as well as terror. And it prompts this hyperarousal response that we've all heard on the defense side, the fight or flight, or a disassociation coping mechanism, which would be to freeze or surrender. So, for example, if you were watching maybe a survival show, you would learn that the best hyperarousal responses to a rattlesnake attack would be flight. To a shark attack would be fight, and to a bear attack would be to freeze and surrender and to curl up into a ball. Just in case any of those happen to you over the rest of your life, you might at least remember what hyperarousal response is most appropriate for a traumatic event of a poisonous snake, bear, or shark attack. The other thing that we all realize is that those who are subjected, and I realize in a sensitivity perspective that most, if not all of us here, have been subjected or surviving some extremely traumatic experiences or love those that have. So I want to not only honor, but also for those who are prayer warriors, continue to lift up everyone that is really going to fear and feel these topics. For self-disclosure, my sister was raped repeatedly by a family member throughout middle school. So as I was talking to a new dear friend, there are those that are in a very small circle that get it, and a very smaller circle who get it and have been blessed with the strength and the drive and the compassion to serve others that are still trapped there. So, some of these traumatic experiences that we realize place those who have been victimized through these experiences at risk include being involved with the child welfare system. We know foster kids, for example, depending on the study that you see, whether it's here, or whether it's Texas, or whether it's in New York, 50 to 80% of CSEC victims or those vulnerable to it have had some time in foster care. Obviously, typically, you end up in foster care because of abuse or neglect in the home, or a few other issues such as being out of control. We also know that childhood sexual abuse is a huge indicator for not only being at risk, but also being victimized. Once again, there's several studies, could be from 60% to 95%. One statistic that always stands out to me, particularly in terms of my sister, is that if you are a woman who had been sexually abused as a child, there's a 28 times greater chance that you will be arrested for prostitution at some time in your life if that hasn't occurred to you. Other traumatic events that are common, that are over-indexed in those that are vulnerable and eventually victimized to child sexual exploitation is experiencing dating violence and or rape, witnessing criminal violence in your neighborhood, within your homes, within your family members. A high percentage, which I just came across the other day, of kids that are eventually exploited that have actually witnessed domestic violence in their home. Typically so early that it is not necessarily considered abnormal or even illegal or unhealthy, seeing their moms abused or battered in their own home situation. Exposure is a huge aspect as well. Once again, this sense of normalization, or this is how things work, or this is affecting my worldview of who I am in the world and what can occur to me in that context. So exposure to drug use or criminal activity or commercial sex, especially among family members, whether they're extended family or immediate family. All of these end up being demonstrated in various signs that have also been identified as indicators of CSEC or childhood sexual abuse. So being sexually active, being a runaway, being homeless, dropping out of school, missing school, having a history of arrest, being a gang member, having a boyfriend that's older than you, or taking drugs or alcohol or even smoking. All of them over-index in this population that we're trying to serve. As I pointed out to a different church group the other day, what's really, I guess, convicting to me is that so often within the church context, kids that have been identified as using drugs or dropping out of school or being, I guess the old school phrase was promiscuous, were typically judged, shunned, avoided, and really, to a certain extent, it's no different than someone who is standing in front of us with a knife wound bleeding on the floor, and we accuse them of being irresponsible and disrespectful to our property as they sit there and make a mess with their bleeding. So, fortunately, I'm with people who understand that. Other forums, that might be the last slide to get through. This popped out to me particularly in terms of the exposure aspect, that those that end up being commercially sexually exploited, it's not a particularly rare or novel concept to them. So this was actually a study that was done with SAGE with 2 categories of sexually exploited young women and children. And you can see the first time of a commercial sexual act, the factors that contributed to it for the young ones, the 13 to 17, 100% of them were for survival, but the second greatest number, the 77%, was exposure. They were familiar with it, someone they knew was engaged in that type of activity, or someone, typically an exploiter, suggested it to them. All of these things overcoming what we might consider barriers to avoiding this exploitation, those barriers come down based on an exposure level. Of course, there's lots of studies out there, and to maybe paint or continue to paint this picture of the type of trauma that these kids have already endured or are enduring in their exploitation. And this is actually 2 studies, one from Missy and the other one from the West Coast Children's Clinic, that talks about kids and what they have endured or suffered during their exploitation. So as we mentioned, most of them have been abused, most have been raped, most had first been sold before 14 years old, most had been arrested, most had been abandoned, most had been in foster group homes, and the other forms of abuse. Some other statistics from those studies, the West Coast Children's Clinic one, for example, they also determined that at the point of these kids being in the study, they had already been exploited, either continually or intermittently, for 2 years or more. Now, this is a long, dark list of symptoms of trauma, the hopelessness and the isolation, the flashbacks, typically the flashbacks that we'll review a little bit more in the form of emotions, not necessarily vivid memories. Difficulty concentrating, feeling numb or overwhelmed, confused, fear, panic spells, also anger, hostility, aggressiveness, hatred, blame, frustrations, irritability, guilt or shame, humiliation, grief, altered beliefs about who they are, what relationships look like, what the world looks like, and other people. Anxiety, nervousness, depression, suicidality, self-harm, cutting, eating disorders, all symptoms of what they have been through. and post-traumatic stress disorder. Now we can look at that whole slide and basically the summation, if a traumatic experience is one that literally scares you witless, the W, this is living hell.
The grant is scholarship, so I can proceed my study this coming June. I will take up accountancy course. Then maybe after that, get a job, save some money to proceed in law school. I realized that I have to do it. I have to do it for my daughter and for the rest of the people who's been his victim. It's like
Okay, so one reason I always like to show that is because at this point I want to see somebody smile. And I love that little hopeful hop that she has at the end. I first saw Charmaine when she graduated from the 12-week job readiness training program, and she was picked, the class of 25 or so, to give a speech. And in that speech, she talked about how she had made this mistake, and then because of that mistake, she had no hope, and her entire life was over, and she came to the point where she believed that this was, literally she said, this is all I will ever be, trapped in this guy's house. Labor trafficking and this sex. And she thanked, of course, the staff, and she thanked God. And she said, you know, I thank you, God, because when I look back, I know that you were always by my side. And the comfort in how she was able to reconcile an all-loving, all-powerful God. And what had occurred to her for a year and a half, trapped in that home, where it seemed like there was no hope at all. But by virtue of the fact that he impregnated her and she got a daughter, she drummed up the courage to tell a guest to that home about her plight. An extreme act of courage because he was a friend of her abuser and her captor. And if he told him, the repercussions would have been severe. Praise God. Instead, he told the police. Now the other reason, besides seeing the hopeful hawk, is you can see during the course of that short video the process of how that trauma had affected her You see, her situation was that her parents split up and kicked all 5 kids out and said, make it on your own. So they are all scattered all over the city as young teens, trying to do whatever it takes to survive. She goes to an internet cafe, does a job search, finds a job search listing for a babysitter, goes to the babysitting potential job opportunity home, and they raped her and kept her. When she talks about being in the shelter, and the social worker talking about how are we going to get you to the point where you can reconcile a new worldview on who you are, who others are, what the world is about, and what relationships look like. She kept saying, I just want to go home. Charmaine didn't have a home to go to. Then, with more encouraging and more loving, they outlined just this, to us, this little 12-week program. They'll teach you about professional communication and the types of jobs that you might want to do, teamwork and focus. She said she was hopeless. She didn't want to do it. And then slowly, surely, eventually, not only should she go to high school, applies for college, and now, with obviously trepidation, but confidence, going to be an instrument of mercy in God's hands on behalf of others. But that's the process. In terms of post-traumatic stress disorder, actually an international study in 5 different countries that looked at minors and majors, males and females, determined that 75% of those who had been prostituted in some form or another exhibited post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, most experts will say that combat vets underreport their symptoms. However, whether that number is 20% or 40% of combat veterans who also demonstrate PTSD, it's obviously a huge issue for those that we're serving. One explanation is obviously they're kids, and number 2, they weren't trained for it, and